So yeah, I just wanted to start. Maybe you could advance the slide to the land acknowledgement. Thanks. We want to acknowledge that those of us joining from Winnipeg are gathered on the ancestral lands, on ancestral lands on Treaty 1 territory. These lands are the heartland of the Métis people. We also acknowledge that our water is sourced from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation. My name's Heather Milne. I think most of you, if not all of you, I'm one of the co-leads of Museum Queries, along with Angela Failer and Michelle McGow. I'm a professor in the English department at the University of Winnipeg, and my research focuses on queer literature and culture, as well as queer theory, affect theory, museums, and also experimental writing. Museum Queries, as you probably know, is one of the research clusters that's part of the Thinking Through the Museum network. Museum Queries is an interdisciplinary research cluster with collaborators from across Turtle Island that prioritizes two-spirit, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, transsexual, and queer contributions and interventions into museums and museum studies, as well as archives and galleries. Alex, if you could just advance the slide again. We're going to start with some introductions. So I've introduced myself. I think I'll now kind of call on those of us putting on the workshop for you today to each briefly introduce themselves, maybe just a few sentences, tell everyone who you are, what your work is about. So maybe I'll start with Sabrina, who's also, I should mention, kind of co-leading a little bit the workshop with me. So Sabrina, maybe you could introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sabrina Mark. I'm the research coordinator for kind of our part of Museum Queries in Winnipeg. My work is not actually in museums, so like my academic background, but I do have an interest in like lots of kind of theoretical areas that overlap with museum studies, like gender and race and nationalism. So I'm very happy to join you all. Mahlet's next on my screen, so.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mahlet. My pronouns are they and she. I'm an RA for the Museum Queries. Really recently new, I feel like in the past year, so still getting acquainted with a couple of things, but my focus or things I'm interested in is generally the contemporary art and like that kind of how that connects to museums, and thinking about Black queer life across Canada, but kind of circling in and kind of getting more focused on the prairies and even more focused on here in Manitoba. As well as just I'm an artist, as well as a curator and writer, and I also currently work at the Winnipeg Film Group in distribution. So yeah.
Thanks, Mahlet. Maybe Adrienne, could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, for sure. Hi, my name is Adrienne. I'm Two-Spirit. I use they, them pronouns. I'm an Anishinaabe, a member of Couchiching First Nation, and yeah, I guess I'm a PhD student, hopefully soon to be candidate. I just submitted my candidacy exams last week and defend on Monday, so fingers crossed. Yeah, most of my research looks at Two-Spirit, queer, and trans Indigenous visual culture. I am a curator and performer as well. And most recently, I've been looking at like lowbrow performance, so a lot of erotic art. I look at drag, burlesque, that kind of stuff, and just trying to figure out its place in a museum, or if it is, in fact, its place is in the museum. So yeah, that's me.
Thanks, Adrienne. Mika?
Hi, everyone. My name is Mika Castro. I use any pronouns. I'm an undergraduate student at the University of Winnipeg, and I've also been a research assistant for Museum Queries for, I think, 4 years now, since my first year of undergrad. My research has mostly looked at Canadian immigration policies, nationalism, and also multiculturalism. in Manitoban museums like the CMHR and the Manitoba Museum. That's me. It's good to see everyone here today. I'm excited for this workshop.
Thanks, Mika. And I think last but not least, we have Niamh.
Hi, everybody. It's so nice to see and meet all of you. My name is Niamh, and I use they, them pronouns. I am an MA student in the Cultural Studies program here at the University of Winnipeg, and I've just been an RA with Museum Queries since September, actually, this year. So right now my work is still in some pretty early stages, but I'm interested in investigating how the HIV/AIDS crisis has been articulated and recalled by institutions and organizations of public memory. So I'm just working on that. And generally, I'm really interested in ideology studies and technopolitics. So that's me.
Thanks, Niamh. Now you've met our awesome team. We're all very cool and we're all very excited to be here. I'm gonna, I think, start by giving a bit of an overview of SnapThoughts, sort of what they are, and then talking about their pedagogical value or how we see them being valuable pedagogically. And then Sabrina is gonna take us through looking at some SnapThoughts, and the RAs will talk a bit about their SnapThoughts, and then we'll do an exercise with where we'll produce some SnapThoughts towards the end of the workshop. All right, where are we at? Okay, SnapThoughts and overview. Thank you. That's exactly where I want to be. Okay, so what are SnapThoughts? SnapThoughts are short responses in the form of a few sentences, like maybe sort of 2 to 4 sentences. And the idea is that these are responses that one drafts fairly immediately following a visit to a site like a museum or a gallery. I suppose you could also do SnapThoughts in relation to other things as well, like a performance, a play, a poetry reading. You know, you could do them in response to anything. But due to the nature of our work in Museum Queries, we tend to think about them mainly in relation to museums and galleries. So it's an immediate response, ideally drafted shortly after the site visit. And the idea of a SnapThought is not to produce a comprehensive overview of an entire exhibit, but to take one thing, a detail. It could be anything. It could be like a item in the exhibit. It could be something about the architecture, the curation, an effective response that you have to the exhibit. It really can be anything. So it's not a comprehensive overview, it's a small aspect. So it's short, it's focused, it's an immediate commentary. SnapThoughts can take different forms. They can be written. Most of our Museum Queries SnapThoughts are written, but they could be oral as well. I don't think we've had a visual SnapThought yet, but that could be a possibility. Like you could do them in different forms. I'll speak a bit about kind of where SnapThoughts originated from, where they came from. It's too bad Angela's not here because I think she could speak to the origins of them a little better than me. But from what I understand from Angela, the idea began several years ago in conjunction with a tour that some of us took of the Canadian Museum for Human Rights when the building was still under construction, like it wasn't open yet. And the idea at that time was to come up to people and like interview them, to get a little soundbite with a microphone, a kind of what did you think moment, to capture sort of immediate off the cuff responses. So initially it was this sort of kind of spoken statement, but more commonly they're written statements now. So they've evolved a little bit through the years. As the practice of writing SnapThoughts has become kind of more of a feature on our website and something that we ask the RAs to do with more regularity, the process of writing them has become a little bit more deliberate. So although I'm calling them kind of off the cuff quick responses, I think as they've evolved, they have become, for better or for worse, a little bit less spontaneous, a little bit less snappy, I guess. Sometimes they go through a couple of rounds of edits. I think they also tend to be maybe a little bit longer now than they once were, but the idea behind them is essentially the same. It's something short, something immediate, something fairly focused. I'll speak a bit about what we see as the kind of pedagogical value of SnapThoughts. There are, I think, a number of ways that these are valuable for students. They become a good way for students to learn how to engage critically and actively with a museum space. So rather than passively absorbing the exhibit, they're actively scanning. And, I think sometimes it takes, like students aren't often used to interacting with museums in that kind of active scanning way. Like often we're trained through school. I know like my daughter's been to museums with her school. She's only in grade 5, but the way that they interact with those spaces often is just to absorb them passively instead of to really think critically about, well, what am I experiencing? What's my reaction to this? So they really help, I think, train students to actively scan, to pay attention to their own affective response to the museum, to take note of different things. So they're paying attention actively. But also because SnapThoughts are about like reflecting on one dimension of an exhibit, they're less overwhelming than having to produce like a critical response to an entire exhibit. So students may not feel like they can respond to an entire exhibit, but they will feel like they can respond to one small dimension or one small aspect of it. So in this regard, I think they're more manageable for students. And they also work well for students at different levels. Like you can do a SnapThought exercise with undergrads, you can do it with graduate students, you can do it with professors, and it's a useful experience for people really at any stage. You can also bring 10 people into a museum and they'll come away with 10 really different SnapThoughts. So when you share these, they become great opportunities for learning from each other and for learning what kinds of things different people notice or what they take away from a visit to a museum, because of course, everybody will take away something a little bit different. Sometimes a SnapThought can be a seed for something bigger. Some of our students have had ideas that start as SnapThoughts, but then they evolve into bigger projects. So a SnapThought can eventually become a blog post or a conference paper or even an article. Sometimes a SnapThought doesn't go beyond being a SnapThought, and that's totally fine too, because SnapThoughts, I think, have intrinsic value in and of themselves. So those are, I think, what we see as some of the values or the ways that having people do SnapThoughts is useful. I'm going to hand things over to Sabrina, who will talk about some examples of SnapThoughts that our students have done. I think we can move to the next slide as well.
Alex, if you could click on the link. And I don't know if that means you have to like share a different screen, maybe.
Yeah, can you see what's up on my screen at the moment?
No.
The website? No, okay, so just 1 sec. I'm just gonna stop and
Sorry.
I'll reshare. There we go.
There we go. Do you mind scrolling down to the bottom? I just want to kind of give a bit of an overview of, like, we have many SnapThoughts on our website now. On the Museum Queries website, so that's museumqueries.org. Museum Queries has been doing SnapThoughts since like long before I was there. The first one is from January 2020, and our most recent one is September 2022. So what you might notice if you take the time to like browse through these is that, as Heather noted, they're really applicable for a wide range of venues. So although we focused primarily on sort of museum and gallery spaces, you can see that there are talks, there are roundtable discussions, there are workshops, in addition to more kind of conventional gallery, art gallery exhibits and museum exhibits. We've also done this really neat mix of in-person and virtual tours. So the virtual experience has been really interesting because you can kind of not only bring people together from different spaces like we're doing right now, but you can also kind of visit a space there where like you aren't. So we were lucky to, as it's in this example here, go to the archives with the queue and get a really neat tour of that space in Toronto. This was always also really handy during the pandemic because yeah, like nobody's getting together then, right? So it's been really great to kind of keep up the momentum and still get to have these really great experiences of sort of touring or seeing or interacting without physically being there. As Heather also mentioned, it's possible to like do these in a wide range of media. So not just written, even though ours on the website are written, but originally they were kind of little interviews. So they could be recorded on video, they could be done on audio recordings. And we've kind of talked about possibly expanding how we do SnapThoughts and putting those on the website. There's a possibility for other potential formats. I am kind of intrigued about what a SnapThought might look like if it was a visual piece, like maybe a small collection of images or photographs. I don't know. I think that would be a neat venue to kind of explore. So the whole process of when we do these SnapThoughts, going from like the event or whatever we're attending to this kind of finished product on the website. Alex, could you just like click on one of them? It doesn't matter which one. So we go to some kind of event in a group, and you can see us, we're there together at the Winnipeg Art Gallery to see transmissions. So we go in a group, and I think this encourages critical conversation and reflection. It's really good and like generative to hear from others, get different perspectives. People notice things that you don't pay attention to, right? Just because everyone is coming from their own point of view. So this is sort of like a time for reflection, and the research assistants will tell you like how they approach visiting a space and with the mindset of the SnapThought kind of in the future. After we've gone, I email everyone and ask them for a SnapThought, and they submit a SnapThought to me, and I tend to help edit for clarity and grammar, but this is kind of I don't want to say difficult process, but it can be challenging sometimes to make sure that we maintain the meaning of the person's original thought and not kind of impinge on that with the editorial process. So just helping the person get their ideas to the reader. And I think that this is like a continuation of the collaborative process, right? So we go in a group, you might create it originally on your own, but as we're kind of editing and preparing them for the website, like that's another collaborative process. We always try to include some kind of image. I think visually it's more pleasing, like aesthetically, but it's also nice for whoever's seeing the website, right? Like to get some kind of idea of what the environment was, like where were we, or that even just like kind of proof we were there. I also add a little write-up at the top of each one just for context. I include a link there to the institution or the exhibit website so that whoever is looking at these is able to learn more about the exhibit or the space. You know, it might prompt someone to go and see it. We've heard also that some people at those institutions read our SnapThoughts, like they check out our Museum Queries website. So I think it's also nice to link it back to them, so that they're being acknowledged for their work as well. So once it's up on the website, the last thing we do is share it on social media, so that, yeah, just to kind of get the word out. I think those sort of connections are really important with this. We're not just writing things in a vacuum on our own in isolation. It's about kind of sharing thoughts, prompting other thoughts, and hearing from each other. So, yeah. Thanks. If we could go back to the slideshow. Thank you, Alex.
No
And
problem.
we'll hear from the research assistants about their own personal experiences.
Hi again, Mahlet. So in terms of my process and thinking through my SnapThoughts, I kind of reflect. So I reflect on the feelings from seeing the artwork or the archive or exhibition. So for example, the one that's up on the slide here, I had talked about the exhibition we had seen at the Winnipeg Art Gallery by Mariana Munoz-Gomez, who's a local curator here in Winnipeg. In the show titled Transmissions, which talks about like embodiment and how different artists in that show are able to capture that. So for myself, like walking into a space, seeing the artwork, and then also just like proposing questions and thinking through a critical lens each time I'm doing a SnapThought. Sometimes I'll like take little notes with myself, like take little notes when I'm in the exhibition or something on my phone, and then kind of be able to go back to it when I'm writing it. But as well as I think for SnapThoughts, like I like to kind of think about them as like almost a review in a sense, or like an art critique, but at the same time, like taking away like the rigidity around it and like the structure, the hierarchy of it, just and kind of like playing around with it, this idea of like what is looking at something and having my own personal feelings about it, or applying something from a different show I'd seen and making connections. As well as I think Sabrina had mentioned it before, but just this process of writing a SnapThought, it sometimes feels like you're alone, because like you're going to a group setting with other people, you're seeing the artwork or you're seeing like the archive or exhibition, but then you're going back to like by yourself and writing it. So sometimes it does feel in a way isolating, but at the same time, having Sabrina edit it and kind of clarify my thoughts is really helpful, because for myself personally, sometimes I just put all the feelings and I'm like, what are you trying to say? So it's kind of nice to have Sabrina like ask certain questions and be like, okay, what are you trying to say here? Do I understand what you're saying in terms of looping? Like, for example, in here it says like the assumptions are brought up onto those that are very interesting to me, since the artist proposed the potentiality of the person in the photos being queer. So clarifying those thoughts and kind of getting a sense of generally what I'm saying. But overall, I think for myself with SnapThoughts, I kind of like to like focus in on one thing or like one artwork and then kind of pull it apart. So overall, I feel like it's a very collaborative experience of not only me seeing something, but seeing with other people, and then going back and forth with Sabrina in terms of what I'm trying to say around it. And then I think there's another question around how does knowing you'll need to write a SnapThought influence your experiences when visiting a museum or gallery or archive, and what is my thought process around that visit? So it gives me like the chance to kind of sit down and reflect on what I was able to see and put words to it. Because I think sometimes you walk into a space and like, oh, this is how I feel, and then like that's it. But I feel like with SnapThoughts, it gives you a chance to kind of ask yourself questions, ask why this made you think more deeply, or why it made you like maybe feel uncomfortable or feel happy or feel sad or angry, like all these different things. But with this show specifically, I did like it a lot. So it was kind of easier to write it to a certain extent. And a couple of the artists in the show I've seen before or haven't seen before. So it's kind of see their works in a space together. It was really enriching. And with this one specifically, with the work of Gonzalo Reyes Rodriguez, I thought it was super interesting just because it talks about this artist finding works that in a thrift store, like photographs that he just assumed that was a queer person because it had like these queer elements to it or like embodied practices within it. And then he made his own assumptions around those things and he applied his own personal photos as a queer person. So I think with that was kind of be able to reflect on that and think like, oh, how did he come to these like conclusions, and then be able to write about it. I thought it was really fun, and to kind of think about what does it mean to embody things or embody practices. And then before I mention, when I walk into a space or whatever, I kind of sometimes take notes, or just kind of, I know I'll forget, so I take a note of the thing that had interested me, and then kind of go back to it and refer back to when I'm writing my SnapThought. As well as, I think overall a SnapThought gives me the opportunity to kind of think critically about the work that I'm engaging with, and thinking about like a space like the WAG, for example, where oftentimes there maybe isn't a lot of representation of BIPOC artists, because this exhibition specifically had all BIPOC artists. So I think thinking about the space itself and thinking about how the curator was able to hold space and hold space for all those artists together, I think it made me think more critically about art space and institutions, and who gets to be in those spaces, and how they're able to, express certain themes and ideas that maybe are not often expressed in certain spaces like that. So I think for myself, SnapThoughts are really insightful to a certain extent. We're just thinking about being critical, thinking about what I'm trying to say, what is the interpretation that I'm trying to get across in terms of whatever the curator or like the thing that I'm looking at. Yeah, I think those are all my things. Apologize if I also talk really fast, that's which is a bad thing of mine. So I'm happy to repeat things if people have questions or to kind of go back. But yeah, I think for myself, SnapThoughts are for me a process of reflecting, collaborative, and then just thinking critically about what I'm looking at or what I'm seeing or listening to as well.
You did a great job, Mahlet, don't worry.
Thank you.
Yeah, as for me, my process of doing a SnapThought, like prior to going to an exhibit or a gallery, knowing that I have to write a SnapThought actually helps me look at a gallery or an exhibit very differently, knowing that I'm actually going to have to be critical instead of just absorbing everything that's going around me. That means like actively asking myself questions while I'm viewing an artwork or an installation has been very helpful. And as for SnapThoughts, they're mostly for me just expanding on the thoughts that have been floating around my head while I'm looking at the exhibit. And also, like Mahlet, I also usually take notes while I'm in the museum. And these notes are usually just like a list of words or even some photos that I've taken. And going back on these have really helped me, create my SnapThought later on. And in this particular SnapThought, I talk about the, what was the exhibit again? The Behind Racism exhibit at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. And in here, I reflect on just the conversations that we were having before going to the exhibit, conversations around the Museum of Human Rights' anti-Black racism, and also just the hashtag CMHR Stop Lying, which was actually created by a former Museum Queries research assistant, Tiane. And so these conversations that I was holding with me prior to going to the museum have actually affected the way I saw the exhibit that day. So that's just sort of like a summary of what my SnapThought was about. out. There's really no pressure to make it into like a finalized thoughts, and also that my thoughts don't really have to be right the moment I write them. And it's also kind of good to look back on them and actually like remember, oh, like this is what I thought about an exhibit that day. So they've been really helpful in digesting certain parts of an exhibit or a gallery. And it's also fascinating to just see the different points of views that the other RAs have, and looking back or looking at their SnapThought once they've been published, and just see how vastly different or similar they are from mine is really fascinating. But that's for my SnapThought. I'll don't know who the next person is.
I think it's me. I think it is me. Okay. So I have fairly limited experiences with SnapThoughts, and that is because I've only been an RA with museum queries for long enough to submit this single one. So I don't know if I can really answer to having a process or not, but I can describe certainly what happened to me when I wrote this SnapThought. So this was from the visit that we did at the Winnipeg Art Gallery, transmissions. So during this visit, I had my journal with me and I took some very like generative first impression notes. I found that I speculated that might help me remember what I saw and what I felt those particular moments. I also took some photos on my phone with next time if I want to have some help in remembering my small process. Like Mahlet said, I think posing critical questions during the exhibit and also listening to my peers ask their questions and engage with what we were looking at was really helpful to me in my own witnessing, like in a deliberate and careful way. So that is how I approached writing my first ever SnapThought. I write one influenced the experience, and my visit to the WAG. Generally, I felt cognizant of the assignment the entire time. And so there was this internal conflict where I found my mind was asking my body to just stay in the room and to like remain mentally and emotionally with what was before me, with the exhibit and with the art and the people around me. I felt myself like internalizing some sort of pressure to come up with something like thoughtful and so insightful, like to have insightful generative notes, so that I could maybe come up with something incisive later, which is not at all what SnapThoughts needs to be, and it doesn't require that from me. So I guess all of this is to say that my hope for next time is that I could practice looking and witnessing and to just be there for the sake of being there, and to still take notes and have these like, and to be in the moment, to be thinking critically about the things that I worried less about what I might say or come up with later. So that is something I'm excited to learn more about as I write more SnapThoughts, and I feel excited to experiment with practicing witnessing more meditatively next time. That's kind of all I know about SnapThoughts at this.
Yeah, so I wrote about also the Canadian Museum for Human Rights and their Behind Racism exhibition. And like my peers, I also would write down notes as a process. I think that I am a very visual person, and so taking photos, but also taking notes, it allows it to kind of like stick into my head and thought process when I, have to return to it later. So I found that to be very helpful. One thing I also found to be helpful, and I know it was touched on as well, is consulting like with my peers and everyone else in the group, just to see, if there are elements of like criticality that I have, if they are in fact warranted, if there are things that I've missed only because I don't it's almost like a fact check, you don't want to really convey something if it wasn't necessarily correct. So that is something that's like super helpful, or has been super helpful with the group. Or if there's if there's anything I missed. So yeah, it does feel like a bit of a review for me, and a challenge that I have is to make it more concise, because obviously it's not like a 500 word review, it's like a paragraph, right? So yeah, that's definitely something I'm working through. And yeah, I guess even when I think about like writing reviews, or when I am thinking about SnapThoughts, it's when there is when you do have like a critical, or if there's something that maybe doesn't sit well with you, I feel like it is important to kind of have a supporting statement as to why, because you will often get asked with questions to have yeah. So it does, having to write a SnapThought does in fact influence my experience with visiting any exhibition. I think that it's not a negative thing. It does allow me to be more present, as opposed to an exhibition and seeing it more of less of like a surface level, more of like an aesthetic, and rather I have to think of it a little bit more, I don't want to say like intellectually, but it's less subconscious. It's very like in my head and literal. So that's certainly a challenge as well. But I think that giving an exhibition that kind of space, that time to really engage and to really be well versed, or to be understanding of the content, is something that I would hope as a curator that people would engage with that as well. So it's kind of like it's like finding a balance between the two. I think that's it. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks,
So-
everyone. Oh, sorry, you go ahead, Sabrina. You can take it away.
Oh, thanks, Heather. Thanks, everyone. It's so good to hear about your processes, because there's similarities, there's differences. We actually have a short break scheduled for right now. The second part of our workshop is going to be like the activity. So we're going to watch a video and make our own SnapThoughts. So, but yeah, maybe like a 10-minute break.
do you need more time? Let me know in the maybe in the chat or give me a thumbs up. I can't see everybody, but has this been enough time to sort of get a few thoughts down? Yeah, okay. Alex, you can stop the screen sharing maybe now and we can sort of see each other's faces. All right, so I think we just would like to now kind of open it up for folks to, if you want to, if you feel comfortable, to share your snap thought or to maybe say a little bit about what the process was like for you, if anybody wants to do that.
I can start things off.
Sure. Okay.
Oh, yeah, so like when I'm thinking about snap thoughts, usually what happens is like something will kind of click in my mind and I won't be able to stop thinking about it. For me, it started kind of right at the beginning of this video. My snap thought says, the virtual tour begins with a portal as a door, an entrance to the exhibit, which brought to my mind ideas not only of letting people in, but also gatekeeping and keeping people out. Later, the exhibit raises the visual, racialized physical markers that people use as a gatekeeping device and as a justification to enact violence. For me, it prompts questions of how do people decide how they will keep others out or keep others othered? What lines do they draw or create for this purpose?
That's great. Anybody else? Oh, I see 3 hands have gone up. Let's go Shelley, Emily, and then Erica.
Okay. This is kind of in the spirit of what the hell, I'll go. But wow, Sabrina, yours was so like crisp and comprehensive. Like it got it. This is I think much more, this is different, this is raw. Curator John Hampton's last words in the virtual walkthrough of Conceptions of White are "look again." This is exactly what I will do. Getting a glimpse of this exhibition reminds me how much I wanted to see it. Why? It offers tools for critical race museology, a sweeping view of theories and practices of whiteness in Western galleries and beyond. In this a bit too fast walkthrough, I feel a range of emotion: anger at the harm enacted by theories of whiteness, curiosity about Deanna Bowen's piece that shows colonialism and racism in one story, and a touch of fear regarding Bailey's humorous but real look at performative activism.
Great, thank you, Shelley. Emily.
Thanks. Mine's a little bit sloppy too, but I was thinking when I was very aware that I was, pursuing this activity, then I was thinking about what Adrienne, what you said about that being okay, that awareness is okay, and it just brings you to a different place. So yeah, this is one of the first exhibition videos that has captured my attention from start to finish. What a profound and diverse collection of our works. When you're the problem, we're the solution. That's about me. And it's also, it's so deep, and it's also very funny. And I'm okay with that. As a gallery educator, I was thinking about the scholarly tone of this video and how differently the experience would be to engage in dialogue in the actual space. As a white gallery educator, I'm still thinking about what conversations, sorry, my handwriting is very messy, what conversations might have taken place around the mediation of this exhibition, questions of representation, voice, intention, appropriation, and white people's responsibilities in dismantling white supremacy. That's it.
That's great. Thanks, Emily. Erica?
Yeah, so mine, everybody's making these excuses about how rough they are, but mine will be yet rougher. And this is essentially didn't really, it's just notes, and so I'm going to speak it out. And I just added something, in fact. So I think the first thing that came to my mind was early on in the video, this question of white identity versus whiteness. And sort of thinking about white identity, I was thinking like, so who embraces this, and what's the difference between embracing white identity versus acknowledging the privilege that white identity bestows when someone else projects it onto you, right? And so I was sort of wondering about, do these things get unpacked in the exhibit? I also, sort of similar to Emily, I was thinking, wonderful and compelling as this was, I still felt like, is this a bit too jargon filled and too of a sort of academic register to kind of engage with, you know, a whole range of communities. And then finally, I was kind of curious why both curators wore white shirts. And I thought that was an interesting level of sort of provocation. And I kind of wondered if there was any point that that gets unpacked. So that's me. And I also have a question I'll leave till later, but if there's a point at which we can discuss the process, I had a question about SnapThoughts more generally. So just put a pin in that.
Yeah, we'll have time for questions too at the end. Does anybody else want to share? Yeah, Jason.
So I really did find that this was a good way to become more kind of like intentional in my observation. So like, I think I would have viewed it entirely different if I wasn't thinking about what I was going to have to say. And I think what captured me a lot about that was the music, because it was unaddressed. So like, this is my SnapThought. Slow intentional gestures introduce us to a series of heavy white forms, but not really, because a white world is entirely flat, while this one is full of shadow. Chiaroscuro sneaks out from beneath the noses and armpits of the Greco-Roman sculptures. A piano tinkles gently in the background with open consonant intervals, and I wonder, is this performed only with the white keys?
That's great. Rebecca, I think I saw your hand go up as well.
That was an interesting exercise. A little stressful to write with a very specific short deadline. I had to turn my camera off so no one could see my like scrunched up writing face. But I was struck by the idea of hierarchies of whiteness that was also discussed in the video. So my SnapThought is conceptions of white highlights the tangled roots of our modern understanding of whiteness and how hierarchies of whiteness are often at play in our assessments of what qualifies as white. From provocative questions like when were white people invented, to digital tools that measure degrees of whiteness, the exhibition ensures that visitors take away with them an understanding of the many shades that color our conceptions of race, power, and privilege.
Thank you. That's great. Does anybody else want to share? I want to make sure everybody has an opportunity if you so want to, but nobody has to. Okay, we're good. So there we have 6 SnapThoughts. They're all amazing. They're all insightful. They're complementary but different, right? So you can see how folks can look at the same thing and, have kind of a distinct sort of interaction and engagement with it. I will say that, in having you do this, like, it's a bit unfair to you because of course you're watching this video, and I know, like, I wanted to spend a lot of time with a lot of what I saw in that video and stand in the gallery and think about it. And instead it's like, 30 seconds on each artist. So it is hard, right? So you don't have the opportunity to really dwell on it as you might in an actual physical visit to a gallery. And then of course, I think I gave you like 7 minutes to write up a SnapThought, whereas in reality, you'd have more time. But you folks are brilliant. You came up with, I think, amazing insights into this video and the exhibit as well. So so that was great. Does anybody have any thoughts on, reflecting on the process of writing SnapThought? I know, Jason, you mentioned, and other people mentioned, that you kind of engaged in the exhibit a little bit differently, knowing that you had to write a SnapThought, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts on what that process was like, if anybody wants to share. Adrienne and then Erica.
Yeah, I guess kind of briefly, I had maybe like an introductory sentence just outlining how I saw the exhibition, but also like how I felt about it. And then I kind of sandwiched it in between. So there was like introductory statement and then an example of one of the artworks that I saw, and then concluded it with like a concluding statement in 3 sentences. So that was my process.
Erica, yeah. I
was just wondering, you know, I mean, this relates to my question, which will come later, about the sort of genre of a SnapThought. And I there's something that I love about that comes up in the, you know, the idea or the sort of name SnapThought of something really raw and really just kind of first thought that often gets lost, you know, when one starts thinking about an audience and trying to sort of process, you know, really writing something where you feel like you have to polish it in some way. And so I was just kind of wondering about that. Like, is there a way, like, I'd love to feel like SnapThoughts can preserve that kind of snappy rawness, that first thought, that unpolished sort of sentiment that, you know, as we try to write it more beautifully, sometimes the edges of it, which are so potent, kind of get smoothed off, and when we start theorizing and trying to say something bigger about it. So I just was reflecting on that.
Yeah, and that's something that, like, when we were planning this workshop, we talked about how the SnapThought has sort of evolved in a way that from that sort of raw, immediate thing to something that's more polished. And I think it's, you know, there's the good and bad things about that, right? Like, people feel if something's going to be published on the website or, you know, if it's going to live somewhere, of course, people feel like they want their grammar to be perfect and their ideas to be brilliant. And that's understandable. But yeah, sometimes there is value in that immediate sort of unfiltered response to something that, you know, maybe, you know, you go to a museum with a friend and you're walking out of the building and you say something to them about, you know, what you thought, like, more the kind of that idea. I think it's nice to sort of preserve that. But I mean, it's difficult, right? Because when you start sort of saying to students, like, you have to produce a SnapThought, it's part of your work, then they want to do a good job, right? They want to produce something that's smart. They want to produce something that's polished. So it's a bit of a catch-22 in a way. Shelley.
I found the time pressure difficult personally. Like, I kind of panicked and I was like, I want to react to that. I want to react to that. And so in that sense, I kind of just, I did let it just be raw, like, in that sense. So that was kind of I you know, I'm happy that I have this little 3 sentences, like, it feels like something, you know, so I feel that's very productive. But listening to you, I would imagine that the facilitation process, you know, whoever's, you know, and the editorial process is extremely important here, because, you know, you're like, I could hear it. I think it was Adrienne talking about working with Sabrina. Sorry, Sabrina or Sabina?
Sabrina.
Sabrina, thank you. You know, a process of validation, you know, like that every SnapThought has its validity, and it's yeah, it's as simple as that. That seems to be like a really important part of all of this.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of that we're supported in this process. And I like the way the editorial process, clearly it sounds like you do it in part very much by asking questions, not just telling a person or editing it for them. You know, you're saying, well, what are you trying to say? So I think that would be, for me, part of the pedagogy of all of this.
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think that editorial process is important, and also, really having students hear that there's no wrong SnapThought. Like, your experience of an exhibit is your experience of an exhibit, right? You're a human being with a subjectivity and a brain and a body, and you're going into a space and you're going to experience it in the way that you're going to experience it, and you're going to be drawn to certain things or not. You're going to be engaged or you're going to be bored, you're going to be frustrated, you're going to learn things, and that's totally fine. And so whatever comes out of that is very legit, and something that is of value to us, and we want to hear about that, because it's part of, these are spaces, museums and galleries, they're spaces of engagement, they're public spaces where people go to engage with ideas, to learn about stuff, to that's the purpose of it. So yeah, I think yeah, it's important. Alex.
I think Emily had her hand up first. I don't know if Emily wants to. Are you sure? Okay. Mine's pretty quick, and I actually think it relates to what you were just talking about. But I find it really interesting that, like, you're doing, not only it's like, this isn't only just like a side thing that Museum Queries does, but that it's kind of part of some of the students' assignments, it sounds like, as well. And to me, that's really interesting because the university, is structured in a way where, like, we do this level of work and we get this level of grade. And so I love this idea of kind of like throwing that out a little bit and saying, like, it's okay if it's not perfect, or if a lot of feelings come up and you want to talk about that. And I'm just wondering, maybe this is more a question for you, Heather, is just like, how do you approach that from like a marking and professor sense as well? It definitely poses like some issues with like the structure of like academia generally.
That's an excellent question, and one that I wish Angela were here to answer, because I think, and I mean, maybe those of you who've actually been in Angela's class, maybe Mika could speak to this, whether Angela does these for grades in her classes. We do them with our Museum Queries RAs as an RA assignment, and that's sort of my experience with them. So there's not a grade attached to it. It's kind of part of your RA job, and part of your training as an RA is like learning how to engage with these spaces and think about them in different ways, and also kind of learning from the other RAs on the team about their experiences of an exhibit or whatever. But I think, Mika, does Angela do you know, or anybody else? I don't know if any of the other RAs have been in Angela's actual classes. Does she do SnapThoughts with students for grades?
No.
Okay. She might in a grad course that she teaches on museums, a course called The Idea of the Museum, that's in our grad program. But I don't think she's teaching it this year. And so Niamh, you're not in that class. And yeah, so I don't know. That's an excellent question. So how would you go about grading something like this? And I mean, something to think about, right? If you're going to sort of set this as an assignment. I mean, I might be inclined, sometimes in my classes, I have students do assignments, and my grading is like, if you do it and you put work into it, you're going to get an A. If you kind of phone it in, then you won't, right? So if a student kind of shows up and does the SnapThought and they've put effort in, then, I would be inclined to give that a high grade, like an A. But other people might sort of approach that differently. But yeah, it does become an interesting question, for sure. Emily.
Thanks. Yeah, my questions were actually around using this as a teaching opportunity as well in class. And yeah, I have in my own classes, I have a lot of marks for participation and engagement, and those are pass-fail exercises. So I could imagine this being integrated in that aspect of the course. But I was thinking about time, so that was something I wanted to put out to everybody first, was sort of how much time from start to finish. It would vary, I imagine, from person to person, but if you were going to propose this as an in-class exercise, to think about how much time would be devoted to it, like having done this for however many minutes we did, was it enough? And then the other questions I had, if we were thinking around the editorial process, if that could be somehow adapted to a peer exercise where you're looking at each other's SnapThoughts and giving feedback, and just questions around safety, you know, and this kind of like that you're talking about this idea of it being something that you might say to a friend, but when you're not talking to a friend, right? This is an exercise that demands a certain level of trust. And even what we did today, I think, you know, you all would have made the decision to include this video and trust, you know, trust me, trust others to write something, say it out loud and hear it. And, you know, hope that this sort of unfiltered, rough reflection isn't going to do somebody else some harm. So I just was curious about that aspect of the work as well. So time, kind of more logistically, but also, yeah, questions around hearing others' unfiltered thoughts and what that means for, yeah, questions around safety in the classroom.
Yeah, those are excellent questions. I mean, I think in terms of, I'll address the time one first, because I think it's the easiest, right, of those things to address. And feel free, other MQ folks, to weigh in, those of you who've written these, what your insights are on time. I mean, obviously today, the nature of the workshop, you did not get enough time to write a SnapThought. You had like 6 minutes or something. I think in terms of time, like SnapThoughts, I think work best in a way when they're fairly immediate, like when the experience of what you've seen is fresh in your mind. So it's not something that you want to leave for weeks or months. But you also, you know, ideally you want enough time to sort of think. Like there's a value to your immediate response, right? Like sometimes you see something and you have an effective response, and that is that has intrinsic value. But sometimes you have an effective response and then you go away and you think about it and you know, rationalize or intellectualize it. That can also have intrinsic value. Sometimes it can take away from the immediate response. So I think there's sort of no one size fits all, but I would say like in a class, like if I took a class or we take a group of RAs to a museum, like we would put out a call for SnapThoughts, like Sabrina would for our RAs, like, you know, people would go knowing that this was, you know, maybe an expectation. And I don't know, Sabrina, you probably would collect those within a few days. Is that accurate? A couple of weeks?
Yeah, usually I'll send out an email within a couple days, and then like the following week people will send back.
Okay. Yeah. In terms of the other stuff, I mean, I think the stuff about safety, of course, is important, like, you know, that trust of sharing your ideas with folks. I think in a class setting, you know, there are things you can do as a teacher over the course of teaching a course to build that kind of trust through various kinds of group activities that allow for students to feel okay about sharing work with each other. Of course, sometimes it can be challenging and there can be, you know, hiccups along the way, but I think that there are ways to do it within a class. I think particularly because SnapThoughts can take a lot of different forms. Like you can write a SnapThought that's very personal, or you can write a SnapThought that's more distanced from yourself, right? That's sort of more analytical. So there's kind of different ways you can do it. So your SnapThought doesn't necessarily have to make you vulnerable. That being said, of course, there's the inherent vulnerability of sharing your work with others, right? With your peers. But again, you know, there's ways that I think as teachers, we ask that of our students through things like class presentations and class discussions anyway. But of course, it's something that I think requires ongoing care and attention, right? And so in terms of cultivating an environment where there is that level of trust and where people do feel comfortable with their ideas. And I mean, coming back to the idea earlier about like the value of the raw SnapThought that's sort of half-baked and off the cuff or whatever, but also the vulnerability of that and how sometimes it's hard to share work that you feel is, you know, sort of an immediate response that you haven't had time to kind of massage into something polished, right? And that's, you know, one of the challenges, I guess, of the process. But also, I think, you know, allowing room for different voices and different styles of SnapThoughts is you know, one way. So people might feel comfortable sharing their ideas in different kinds of formats. Sabrina, did you have your hand up? Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's also like, we wouldn't ordinarily just watch a thing or go to a thing and then say like, write a snap thought. Usually there's like a discussion afterwards. And I think that allows you to have that initial emotional response. And then you can decide later if you want to keep that or if you want something kind of more refined or polished or distanced.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Erica.
Thanks. Yeah. It's funny, just a reflection on the conversation where it now is. There's almost a way in which I feel like in terms of the risk, like at least for me as a teacher, like once something's been refined and digested and polished, my expectations are actually kind of higher, like in terms of that risk. Like if someone's just saying something off the cuff, there's much more, I feel like I give them much more grace because it's like, okay, that's a starting point. But so in terms of the risk, in some way, you can think the risk can be more once you actually have had the time, and then the expectations are higher for what you produce. So that's just a side thought. But the question I wanted to ask, and I have to apologize because my power briefly went out right at the beginning of the original presentation. So perhaps this is something that you addressed in some way. So I'm working maybe with a gap in my knowledge, but I like in terms of the sort of assignment of a snap thought, I was wondering, like, what is the genre of a snap thought, or do they have a genre, right? And because, we all have these like default formats in our head that influence how we narrate things, like these, expectations of what kind of way we should be writing. And so I was sort of wondering, like, are they, a critical review? Are they an appreciation? Are they a personal reflection? Are they sort of more like a promo thing where you're encouraging somebody else to visit, and we could go on and think about different kind of pre-existing formats that someone might just fall into without other direction. And I noted down that I think Mahlet had mentioned like that they were using review as a kind of starting point. So that just said like, okay, so there's an example of one in someone's head. And I was just wondering, like, do you give direction? And I'm the kind of where I'm coming from is I often struggle to get students to critically reflect, to be really critical, right? And I was reflecting back on like these sort of first kind of snap thoughts, although we didn't really have a lot of direction on what is a snap thought that we did for Warsaw. And my experience of those was people said so many really nice things, like everyone was doing this outpouring of how wonderful the experience was because everybody, there was so much wonderful to appreciate. But I was like, what could we have done to get them to kind of focus in on, something a little bit more critical, because I feel like that's a core value is the right word, but that's part of our mandate as a project of thinking through the museum. So that's sort of a long set of steps around this question of like, does this thing have a genre, and is criticality something that you're kind of really pushing, and how do you get students or whoever you're working with to kind of go there or wherever it is you want them to go?
Okay, yeah, I see what you're asking. I mean, SnapThoughts, I guess we think of them themselves as a genre in a way, that then within that can take different tones or different voices, take on different tones or different voices. So I don't think we've given a ton of direction in terms of like, this has to be like a review, or this has to be a critical overview, or it has to contain a degree of criticality. I think that some of that might come a bit in the editing process. Maybe Sabrina can speak a bit to that. I mean, I think we strive for criticality. We strive to I think model for the students and also have them model for each other, like how to actively engage with an exhibit, which I think, as you said, is hard sometimes to get students to think critically. I think our RAs are all critical thinkers. It's like why we hired them. They're all really good at going into a space and sort of, I'm an English professor, so we talk about like reading against the grain. Like when you read a book, like the wood grain, you don't read with the smooth grain, you read the rough, you read against the grain to kind of bump up against things and feel the roughness. And so I think that, you know, there is a way that the students, the RAs do that kind of criticality. But I think, you know, if you did this in a general class, you know, you might have kind of a hard time. So, you know, one option is to show examples, I guess, of different kinds of SnapThoughts that people have done in relation to other kinds of exhibits, right? Or produce some of your own that can serve as kind of examples in a way. I think the risk of that is then you end up concretizing the SnapThought into something rigid, when I think it should be something that's quite elastic and that can allow for different entry points and for different voices. Like I think, and Sabrina spoke a bit about this in terms of editing, like preserving the student's voice and what it is that they're trying to say, and making sure that you don't edit that out, right? And I think sometimes there's a real value to SnapThoughts being a bit raw, as much as sometimes students are uncomfortable with their raw voices being out there. There's something that's nice. So maybe those of us sort of in more powerful positions can model the rawness or the, you know, the half-bakedness of our own SnapThoughts, or like give students permission to that, for that through example. Shelley.
Also, I imagine you would never actually publish something without someone's consent. So that's, to me, like a level of managing, you know, safety as well. If everyone understands that, it's not like this is a forced exercise.
Yeah, for sure. Do any of the other MQ team members want to weigh in on any of this? Any of you with experience writing SnapThoughts want to add your insights, or Sabrina, as someone who often works closely with the RAs?
I will say also, like, watching this video, like this exhibit video, was kind of a more passive experience than we usually have. So I think in promoting that kind of critical inquiry, a lot of that happens in the discussion when we're going through the exhibit, right? Like we'll ask questions, like, or just spout out observations, like, oh, like when we're going through the museum, sometimes it's like, this exhibit's all about white people. Like, did you notice any non-white people? And then we'll, and just like chatting about things like that, I think kind of prompts that direction. But also, yeah, like we like to keep it kind of open, because it can be really generative to have different types of SnapThoughts. So like I find like doing more SnapThoughts is better, because you get to kind of experiment whenever you write a SnapThought. Like I remember Mika's for the transmission exhibit is very different kind of take than from some of the other ones. And it was something Mika really brought up in that particular SnapThought, about how emotional it was versus intellectual.
Yeah, I think, oh, sorry, Alice. Yeah.
Thank you. I just wanted to thank all of your contributions. I just had a question about sort of along the lines of time with Emily's question, but in terms of prep time, you're just talking about discussions afterwards, but I'm just wondering how much prep you would put in setting it up before you attend, like in terms of content, sort of difficult knowledge that might be encountered before, like the discussion after, but what about before, and how much time do you need to put in there if you're going to do this activity?
I'm muted. That's an important question, and you know, maybe one that would vary depending on sort of what you're going to see, right? And so I think if you're going to go and see something where students are going to encounter a lot of difficult knowledge, or there will be, you know, maybe some processing, or students will have emotional responses, you're going to want to do some care work and some prep before you attend or, you know, encounter that material. I think at other times there's maybe very little prep work. Like we went to this thing in the summer at the CMHR, and a couple of the SnapThoughts were on it. And it was that ideas of, was it called Ideas of Race? What was it? Something, the race one at the CMHR.
Behind racism and like challenging
stereotypes or something. So like we had really no idea what this exhibit was. We just knew it was at the CMHR and it was in the sort of temporary space. And we thought, well, let's just go check it out. And I think like we didn't know, like there was very little that we could find out about it, really. I don't think any of us went knowing what it would be. And it ended up being this super weird, like interactive, sciencey, like I think it was designed for Science World in Ontario. So, you know, it was like this weird exhibit with like interactive games, and I think we all found it really bizarre. It wasn't you know, but I guess what I'm trying to say is there was no, it wasn't what we expected, and there was sort of no way we could prepare for it really, because there was so little info about it. But I think, you know, going back to your question, yeah, like I think depending on what you're going to see, you're going to want to do some care and prep work to create a space of safety, right? And I mean, I think, you know, here in Winnipeg, you know, just a personal anecdote, my partner is teaching adult education, adult literacy, and a lot of her students are residential school survivors, and they're planning a trip to the CMHR. And of course, they're going to have to do a lot of prep work and care work around what they're going to encounter there, because students have trauma, students have familial trauma, they have personal trauma. And so, yeah, how do you make that? And they're not going to be writing SnapThoughts, but how do you make that experience a positive one for everyone, and a safe one? And so, yeah, I think that that's important. So the care work is something that may need to be done, I think, depending on what you're going to see. Yeah, does anybody else want to weigh in? Are there any other questions? Comments? No? Okay, well, thank you everyone for participating. I think the thing to take away is that, you know, SnapThoughts are a very flexible, elastic kind of thing, and there's something that you can adapt to your own areas of research and your own styles of teaching and your own engagement. And so, you know, I think what we've shared with you today is sort of what we've developed, which is still kind of in process and still in development, but it's something that that can be modified to suit your needs. So thank you everybody for attending. Oh, Erica, yeah.
I just had a final question based on what you just said. Do you guys have like a set, sort of written out set of instructions of an assignment, or no? So basically you're just all adapting this. Yeah.
It's pretty informal. Yeah.
Yeah. No, interesting. That's great. Thanks so much for this. It's really great. Thanks everybody.
Okay. Thanks, Museum Queries.